Welcome to Counterpoint. I'm Tanya Granick-Allen. Have you noticed food costs have risen lately? Have you been to a local department store and have seen fewer items than normal on the shelves? Have you noticed the price of certain goods has gone up? Many North Americans are bracing for what could be a very challenging fall and winter as the impacts of COVID restrictions, shipping and trucking labor shortages, and shipping container shortages impact our global supply chains. According to a recent report from the American Trucking Association, the industry was already short by more than 60,000 workers pre-COVID. And now that shortage could jump to over 160,000 by 2028. Costco recently told investors on an earnings call that they are capping purchases on toilet paper, paper towels, and water due to shortages. That's right, capping toilet paper purchases. Remember, we thought those days were behind us? Well, I guess they're back. But perhaps some of the biggest impacts will be felt in the agriculture sector. The COVID-19 pandemic led to more robust safety measures and the closing of facilities and borders, which has, of course, affected every section of the chain from the farm to your table. Other factors, such as higher transportation and fuel costs, have increased prices. Fires and droughts across the Northern Hemisphere have also affected the supply of crops, resulting in higher prices for animal feed. For example, the feed price for chickens is up about 20%. Again, this directly impacts you, the consumer. Statistics Canada reported in August that a 500-gram package of bacon, on average, had finally crossed the $8 threshold for the first time. And beef is also up at least 12%, with some cuts up 30%. And were you aware that 10,000 U.S. John Deere workers went on strike recently, and this has farmers worried about being able to plant and harvest their crops? And if there is less supply to meet the demand, then the price of crops will surge. The Ontario government and the government of Canada is trying to help by investing up to $3 million to help Ontario food, beverage, and other agriculture food businesses improve their productivity of their operations. But will this be enough? Will the rising cost of agriculture cripple Canadian farmers and consumers? Well, joining me now to share his thoughts on the matter is Gerry Ritz, former Minister of Agriculture and Agri-Food for Canada and a former Saskatchewan farmer himself. Gerry, thank you so much for joining me today.
My pleasure. Thanks for the invite.
Okay, so how are farmers coping with these increased costs?
Well, there's a tremendous amount of anxiety, especially out where I am. We had a huge drought that covered a good chunk of the area, just didn't get the rain when we needed it. They still did take a crop off, but of course the costs of the inputs, the costs of taking the crop off are still all there, regardless of whether you got 40 bushel or 20 bushel. So at the end, there's a lot of anxiety as to how this is going to all play out. The farm safety nets, the business risk management programs they're called, are there, but in a situation that this wide and this dire, they're not going to be enough.
Okay, but how does this compare to previous years when we've also faced droughts or fires? I remember recently, I think it was a year or two ago, 2 years ago, we referred to it as the harvest from hell. How does this year's concerns with the cost of agriculture compare to previous years?
Far more widespread than we've seen in a long time. I mean, these things have happened before. They are cyclical, but at the end of the day, this is far more widespread. The timing of the rains that we got just weren't there to help, the crops fill. There was hailstorms and so on like that. Seemed to, actually, the Great White Combine was probably a blessing in this year if you had the right kind of insurance coverage. But it's unfortunate that it takes a crisis level before governments of the day or even people, consumers, start to realize that their basic food inputs are at risk here.
So what, yes, you could say that COVID has made people realize, because of course headlines are dominated now. We're going to have a supply chain crisis, or we might have a food crisis. Inflation's going to go up, and people are noticing, those prices creep up. But, most people go about their day. They don't think about farming unless you're a farmer yourself. Have farmers been forecasting something like this for a while?
Well, I'm going to sound like a conspiracy theorist here, but some of this is to turn the page away from COVID that is not going well either. So they need different headlines, different ways to move this thing forward. Farmers buy groceries the same as everybody else. Not everybody has their own beef to butcher or pork, or they don't grind their own flour to make bread that often. So farmers are consumers as well, and they see those costs going up. The one hidden thing here that is
Actually, I'm going to pause you
all
here.
Of these costs going up is the carbon tax.
Sorry, Gerry, I'm going to pause you here. We've got to cut to commercial, but I want to talk about that carbon tax right when we return in a few moments. Welcome back. We're discussing the rising cost of agriculture and what we can expect going forward. And joining me again is Gerry Ritz, former Canadian Minister of Agriculture. Gerry, before we went to the commercial break, you mentioned one of my favorite words, which is carbon tax. And of course, many farmers, many organizations, stakeholder groups have been crying out for years that this carbon taxation that was either looming or now has been implemented would drive the cost of food up. Have you seen that result?
Absolutely. I mean, the carbon tax comes in on 100 different levels, not just the price of fuel going into your tractor or combine, but it's into the delivery truck for that fuel. It's into the school bus that picks your kids up. It's into the hospital locally that all have to pass those costs on. They come out in taxes on your farmland. So those are all creeping up as this thing just permeates layer after layer after layer. And then you start talking about the stores themselves, the trucking into them, the people coming into work, the heating of the unit, the store itself, all costs money and all takes carbon, and there's a carbon tax on that. So what you pay on your till receipt is just a slight reminder of the levels that this thing has gotten into and just permeates everything. And
we've seen more or less a uniform implementation of carbon tax coast to coast. Obviously in the prairies where a lot of the breadbasket of Canada, have they been equally impacted or some provinces more than others?
Well, I think it's fairly equal all across the board. I mean, everybody's had to buy into this thing or your federal transfers slow down. There's all kinds of little gotchas going on there. But at the end of the day, the point being, if carbon is going to be charged on one side of the ledger, there's got to be a credit on the other side. Agriculture is one of the largest carbon sinks in Canada, in the world for that matter, but especially in Western Canada where we do this, we call it precision agriculture, where you don't plow up, you don't turn the soil, you leave it there, and the tilth becomes a stronger carbon sink than ever before. We've got a lot of rangeland, and all of the products that we produce have carbon in them. The grain seeds, the oil seed kernels, the livestock, all are carbon-based organisms. And we export all of that and take no credit for it. So if you're going to charge a carbon tax, then you've got to have the other side of the ledger that shows the credit for the job that's being done. And Canadian agriculture is doing an exceptional job in sequestering that carbon.
Okay, that's an interesting point. I never had considered how farmers themselves would act as carbon sinks, and maybe we'll talk about that in a moment. My colleague Tony Clement, who is the host of Boom and Bust, your former colleague in cabinet, he is working on an initiative called Reshoring to bring production back to Canada. We produce most of our food and grain here in Canada. Is it fair to say that we import very little of our livestock and agriculture? I mean, you're the former minister. I guess you'd have the best handle on this.
No, we're a trading nation. We export up to 90% of what we grow, canola case in point, but we also import 50% of the pork that we eat. We export 50% of the pork and buy back 50% of the pork because we only eat certain cuts of that pig. At the end of the day, we're an exporting nation, but we're also an importing nation. So we get caught coming and going with all of these carbon taxes and regulatory fees and borders that thicken. Even the supply line that's under duress right now coming into the U.S. is having an effect on us.
Okay, let's talk about that. How is that supply line impacting Canada?
Well, we're global in nature. I mean, we rely on those containers going out empty to take a lot of our products back to the Pacific Rim, especially. We need those boats unloaded so they can be turned around and take our product back to the marketplace. There's only so many ships in the world, and when they're tied up sitting offshore, not getting unloaded, of course, that drives the logistics costs back up. Most of these contracts that are taken on supplying India, Japan, China, to name a few, all have costs incurred called demurrage, when that product can't get to where it's supposed to get to in a timely way. So those costs all end up back at the farm gate. It filters down, and that's where they land.
And just for our viewers, to give them some context, maybe you've seen images of this, but we have seen, dozens and dozens, hundreds of large shipping vessels with those large shipping containers, those steel boxes, if you will, stacked up high, just waiting, on the Pacific coast. We've seen it outside of California. We've seen them all over in the coast, waiting to be unloaded, but there simply are delays. We have only 45 seconds before commercial comes, but what is causing this delay? Why are these boats still waiting to unload?
Well, there's a lot of finger pointing, but nobody's pointing at the real causes. And, they're talking about not enough truck drivers once they get into port, but they're not even at port yet. So that whole logistic nightmare is going to hit the ground at some point and just reverberate like a drumbeat across the rest of North America in trying to get all of those cargo ships unloaded.
Yeah, someone recently said, if you're looking for a job in North America, go down to the States. They're paying $14,000 US a week just to be a truck driver. I thought, my goodness, this really must be a huge crisis. I mean, beyond the photos. We're going to discuss this and a little bit more right when we return from this commercial break. Please stick around. Welcome back. We're continuing our discussion on the rising cost of agriculture and some of the concerns with supply chain and how that will impact us Canadians. Joining me is Gerry Ritz, former Minister of Agriculture here in Canada. Gerry, we were discussing some supply issues within Canada, supply chain issues. Obviously, with exports, we export, you said 90% of our agricultural product. That's a lot. If we are not able to get that product out, what happens?
Well, people don't get paid. I mean, contracts can't be taken up. In our case, with the drought that we had, there are some contracts that are going to have to be bought out because they don't have the grain to fill them. But any of the logistics people, the experts will tell you that trains and trucks and everything rely on backhauls to make it feasible, especially with the high cost of fuel. And we're going to see that fuel go up again and again and again in the next 6 months. But at the end of the day, if a train runs all the way to the coast with a load of grain or oil and drops it off and then can't get it onto a boat, the next train going out has to sit there loaded and wait for their turn to get unloaded. Mm-hmm. So that stops the whole delivery system, backs it up, bottlenecks it to the point where it's going to be a real spider web trying to unwind it and get back up to normalcy. It's going to take weeks or if not months.
But how could this have happened? I mean, I know that's such a strange question and you don't even, I guess, have to answer it. But I mean, we're a sophisticated group here in North America. We understand supply chains. How was this allowed to happen?
Well, those boats didn't show up by surprise. I mean, they're on everybody's radar, literally, and they know they're coming and they know why and they know what they have on board. Apparently, there's some politics being played in California that they're looking for some sort of environmental tax before these guys can land. I saw the governor from Florida say, come on through Panama and land in Florida, we'll handle you. But It's on the wrong side of the continent for a lot of that product. So there's some politics being played here. And as I said earlier on, there's fingers being pointed, but some of them should just kind of boomerang and come right back at the people. I don't think there's any one particular cause. I know there's a tremendous amount of people gone missing with COVID, not going to work, not able to go to work, not getting vaccinated, so they're out of work. It's all coming home to roost. And a lot of these are political decisions that were made 6 and 8 months ago that are now starting to come to fruition. And not all of it is good. I mean, there's a lot of negative side here that has to be looked at.
I recently dined at a restaurant and there was a sign in the window that said, due to, the CERB and worker shortages, please don't get angry with our servers. They're doing the best they can. We're understaffed perpetually. And, it made me think, well, if this is what's happening in the restaurant sector, is this impacting also worker shortages impacting agriculture? We understand with the shipping, with the trucking. What about farm? What about temporary foreign workers? Do we see a worker shortage there?
Early on, I mean, it's a big problem in Ontario and British Columbia because a lot of the horticulture rely on imported workers to make that happen. There's a certain amount happens in Saskatchewan too with the size and scope of farms. They rely on predominantly Australians that have the same type of agriculture that we do, right. Australian kids that come in and work on farms. Some of them have been doing it for a number of years in succession. And they were held back this year, which was a real problem early on. Some of that's been addressed. Some of it's there's still shortages out there in getting some of those crops off. But at the end of the day, there's so much more involved here with COVID. And as soon as you thicken a border, there's just a reverberation of problems that carry on. Now we're seeing Biden want to take away our auto sector, and that's not a big thing for agriculture, but we make half-ton trucks, and those are the lifeblood of agriculture. That's how you get to the field. That's how you get your oil and your lubrication and all that kind of stuff. Your service trucks and all that rely on parts and pieces from all the major manufacturers. And if he thickens the border to the point where we have to bring them all in from the States, of course, that makes it more costly.
Oh, yes, and more complicated when we don't have the porous border we used to before COVID hit. Speaking of automotive and manufacturing, John Deere, Terrible timing. 10,000 workers are on strike. I mean, John Deere produces a bulk of farming equipment. Those combines are massive equipment. And you and I were chatting before during commercial that, you put orders in for those farming equipment about a year in advance.
Yes. I mean, there's a tremendous amount of product sitting around on lots with the crop not being up to spec that we thought it was going to be. A lot of contracts didn't get taken up. So there are combines sitting out there. Nobody's feeling a lack of equipment right at this point. What they're feeling is a lack of timeliness on parts that are required. The strike is mostly on the assembly side, as I understand it, but at the end of the day, it still affects people crossing those picket lines and so on to get parts orders in play. And John Deere have their own trucking system. It's very high tech, high end, and a lot of that's being affected as well. So again, it's supply situation caused by a strike, but they're on strike, but at the same point, they can't finish off some of the equipment because of simple little things like computer chips that haven't shown up.
Yeah, we've seen how the auto industry was almost crippled because of this backlog and delays in getting those microchips. We're going to continue this discussion in just a few moments. Welcome back. We're wrapping up our discussion on the rising cost of agriculture. Gerry, just want to kind of step back for a moment. We obviously see that there's issues here in Canada, in America and North America. What about globally? Are other continents feeling a similar kind of stress with either their weather or supply chain issues?
Oh, I can't see how they can't be. I mean, we've embraced this whole idea of globalization. It's cheaper to make car parts in China than it is in Canada. Bring them in; they're part of our assembly line. And the same thing holds true with agriculture. I mean, we rely on major markets to buy. As I said, we're a trading nation. We export on average 50 to 60%. Some as high as 90% of what we produce. At the same time, we're a buying nation where we bring those products back in. So any hiccups along the line in the logistics of the supply line is going to catch us either on the product going out or the product coming in. And in this case, it seems to be on both.
Now, with prices for meat products, grains increasing, who is profiting from this? Who's gaining? I mean, obviously the consumers are losing, a lot of the farmers are losing. Who is gaining from this? Sure. Is anybody gaining?
Well, in an ideal world, everybody in that whole supply line would benefit to a certain extent, but we're not seeing that. Farmers are seeing a higher price for their goods right at the moment, with the exception of beef and pork, which are down a little bit. But at the end of the day, their costs have gone up exponentially as well. So it's about the net gain that you get, not the gross. And everybody wants to point to $20 canola. And, oh my God, it's historically high. But the cost of putting that canola in the bin is at historic highs as well.
Right.
So it comes down to the net value, not just the gross. It's sleight of hand if you don't look at the whole cost.
Now, we touched upon carbon taxation, and I'm sure you'll weave this into your response to my next question, but with the supply chain issues we've been having, with the rising cost of agriculture, and of course, again, with the carbon tax, what would you like to see both at the federal and provincial governments? What kind of programs, what kind of solutions would you like to see from the government? Is there anything they can do to help?
Well, first and foremost is get agriculture exempt from carbon tax at all levels. As I said, it comes in on a number of different formats, but get rid of that because that cost can't be passed on to the full extent that everybody says it can. And that $200 rebate that everybody got doesn't begin to cover what, the increase in your bacon is going to be this year. At the end of the day, governments could do more in the value added side. Agriculture used to be the largest manufacturing sector in Canada. I'm not sure it can claim that anymore. We've seen the high cost of energy, the high cost of labor, the high costs across the board, pushing it out of Canada, predominantly to the US, and then some back to China, and we're importing more. But at the end of the day, value adding would give us another step or two up the rung, and that needs to be done sort of where the crops are grown, not transported around as we see happening now.
And knowing we do export quite a lot to China, and the recent, well, it's been actually a few years of the drama with the two Michaels, for example, and our strained relations. How do you see now that the repatriation of the two Michaels and this new era of relationships with China, do you see that impacting our exports to China?
Well, we were happy to see them come home. I mean, it was a travesty the way that dragged on. But at the end of the day, I don't think there's a simple Band-Aid solution for anybody dealing with China. Australia is going through the throes of that right now. They've cut off the coal supply, which is interfering with the industrial side of China. They have even ordered the stoppage of a lot of industrial commodities, such as crushing canola. Now, we've got a real canola fight going on with China, have had for a couple of years, and that can be resolved simply by getting face-to-face meetings, but they don't seem to do them anymore. I had a group called my SWAT team, basically headed up by a guy named Fred Gorel, that if a situation like that happened, he was on a plane to find out who I needed to meet with. And within 2 or 3 days, I was on a plane following him over to get these things resolved. And we were able to do that, through science-based consultations, dealing with whatever country was involved, and we're able to skip past some of these. This one's been dragging on for a couple of years, and we've got a couple of major canola producing areas that are under stress because they can't export to China, a couple of the big grain groups. So that's problematic. And then when you see the industry shutting down in China because they can't get coal from Australia,
Right.
They can't crush canola, so they don't need it. So it all backfires. It's, as I said, this whole globalization has put us all at risk. I mean, it was good while it worked,
Right.
but when it doesn't work, we all face that tsunami.
Okay, well, on that note, we have to end it there. Thank you so much for joining me, former Minister Gerry Ritz.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Interesting points raised there between supply chains and trucking issues and droughts and all sorts of natural disasters. We can see that the price of agriculture has indeed risen. And of course, the person who will be paying that final bill will be you, the consumer. We'll have to keep an eye on this. For Counterpoint, I'm Tanya Granick-Allen.